Our next speaker, Wab has already introduced in many ways, Cindy Blackstock, who's going to be coming to the stage for a second. Really doesn't need much of an introduction, but deserves one anyways. I think, Wab, you talked about kids and the hope that we all have for children as we move forward in society, and how everybody deserves a fair shake in getting started. Cindy has worked tirelessly for years on multiple fronts at great personal expense, fighting for the rights of kids to have a fair shake in this world. She has planted heart gardens across the country, contributed to films and videos on very important historical figures like Peter Bryce, and as an honorary witness as well, I know works tirelessly on bringing this work of reconciliation and truth to audiences across the country. So please join me in welcoming Cindy Blackstock to the stage.
I love stories. They lift up my heart and my spirit, and they teach us. The songs teach us more because they penetrate our souls in the ways that words could never imagine. And as Wab said, the stories of the residential school survivors have been told with eloquence and with power, both through song, both through spirit and through voice. But the story that I'm interested in, the story I want to tell, the story that I struggle to understand the most, is the story of the Government of Canada. The story of why Canada doesn't do better when it knows better. Why do we spend so much time talking about our capacity and very little about theirs? And so I think, you know, having spent so much time with the government, I would take it upon myself at this occasion to tell Canada's story, the little bit of it that I know. Because understanding that story is fundamental to the process of reconciliation if you believe that reconciliation means not saying sorry twice. Because I am one of those who believes that the answers were always there for the government. They always had the opportunity to do the right thing. They just failed to do it. They chose for themselves to create solutions in their own design, and they did it often with the guise of benevolence, and horrors continued to happen. And I see that even up until today. So let's start with this story. And it's interesting how the Government of Canada's story becomes woven into benevolent words. This is one of the earliest documents on child welfare. Very few people have seen it. And when I talk to child welfare workers, and I'll ask people here, who thinks the child welfare system is failing First Nations kids? I disagree with all of you. Because in order to understand if it's failing children, you have to understand what it was originally designed for. This is a warrant dated 1895. It is a request from Duncan Campbell Scott, who many of you know would have learned, and I did too, in high school about his poetry, which I didn't think was very good back then. Confederate poet or not, he was no Shakespeare. But at any rate, he was also, at the age of 17, hired by Sir John A. Macdonald to oversee a lot of the residential schools. And by 1895, he was in an acting superintendent position. And he requisitions this warrant from the Department of Justice. It allows for the removal of Indian children for the purposes of education, but also because they're not properly cared for. Not properly cared for, what does that mean? What does it really mean? And if you think that someone's not properly cared for, don't you think you should have something better to offer them? First Nations children today are overrepresented in child welfare, primarily due to neglect. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the contemporary definitions of neglect map very closely onto the not properly cared for provision of 1895. What's similar is that back then, the federal government didn't pay any attention to the horrendous impacts of colonization and the poverty of communities and lifted those families up so that they could resume the care for their kids. Instead, they codified it as a failure of the parent to be able to parent at all. And that's what we do in child welfare and contemporary neglect cases. We do risk assessments on the families, but not risk assessment on the alternative that we have to offer. And we never really address the core issues that are driving First Nations kids into care in the first place. Poverty, poor housing, and caregiver substance misuse related to the trauma that Wob so eloquently talked to us about, right? So the system is actually fine-tuned for the purposes of removal. It's fine-tuned to that. Now, back to this story about they know better. And here is one of my heroes. Actually, the day before Prime Minister Harper apologized for residential schools, I found myself in Beechwood Cemetery. I had gone there with a bouquet of brightly colored daisies because they represented the brightness of children. And I was standing before the grave of Peter Henderson Bryce. Peter Henderson Bryce was Canada's first medical health officer. He was wrote Canada's first health code. It's thanks to him that we have universal vaccinations and we have things like water codes, at least off reserve we do. He was the editor of the American Public Health Association, so one of the most preeminent of his time. And at the age of 51, coincidentally my age, he goes over to the Department of Indian Affairs. He's hired by Duncan Campbell Scott, who's receiving these reports that half of the kids who go to residential schools are passing away there. He goes and he studies it, and he finds out that 24% of the kids are dying every year from preventable disease. If you track it over 3 years, it rises to 48%. He goes back to see Duncan Campbell Scott and the Prime Minister and a variety of people in government. He tells them these horrendous findings. He says it'll only take $10,000 to $15,000 to fix it. And that wasn't even a lot of money back then. They were spending $10,000 to $15,000 on tuberculosis treatment just for Ottawa alone in those days. Now, what does Duncan Campbell Scott say? No, we can't afford it. We can't afford to do that. And so somehow, and most think it's from Bryce himself, although we don't know that for sure, his report appears on the front page of the Ottawa Citizen. And this is the actual newspaper from 1907. It was covered in newspapers across the whole country. And I think that's one of the other missing ingredients in reconciliation. You see, it has never been, the wrongs have never happened without people of the period raising the alarm. And it has never been that the government didn't know better. And what it has been lacking is our collective outrage and demand that the federal government actually does something when we hear about this stuff. We have been allowing people like Bryce to scream into silence for decades. That is our responsibility as receivers of the message. It's not enough to know, it's not enough to care. You've got to do something to help these kids. It's also wrong to say that the federal government ignored Dr. Bryce, because they didn't ignore him. They retaliated against him. They cut all his research funding. They stopped him from presenting his research at conferences where he had hoped to get the support of his colleagues to help stop this horrendous horror from happening. And in 1922, he was pushed out of the public service altogether, denied positions for which he was eminently qualified for. But he did not stop. He walks into this building that you can see on Spark Street. So those of you who go to Ottawa, it's right beside the National War Memorial, right beside the post office's building. It's called James Hope's and Son. And he walks in there with a manuscript called A National Crime. And again, he pleads, he screams into silence. He's hoping that people like us would have heard that message and demanded better. Not allowed it to be covered very well in the newspapers for a couple of days, and then overshot by something as frivolous as Elbowgate, right? We should have been on our editors to say, you have to keep covering this until it's gone. Now, what had happened to Dr. Bryce? Well, he dies in 1932, and he's not remembered very well at all. Most Canadians forgot about him. Meanwhile, Duncan Campbell Scott was doing quite well for himself. And Duncan Campbell, or Bryce, was not the only one raising the alarm. This little letter is written by a little boy named Edward B. in the Christmas season of 1923, only a few months after Dr. Bryce's National Crime Report comes out. It's addressed "Dear Parent," and we never know if his parents actually read the letter or not. But what we do know is he was saying that he and the other boys are so hungry, they're eating cats and wheat in the schools. And as a young child, the only reaction he can have to the cruel treatment his teacher is imposing on him is to strike her the next time she's not mean to him. There's another important thing about this letter. It did get somewhere. It ended up in the hands of Duncan Campbell Scott. And what was Duncan Campbell Scott's reaction to Edward B.'s letter? That 99% of the kids in the residential schools are too fat anyway. The year that Duncan Campbell Scott receives this letter, he's the president of the Royal Society, the top academic forum in Canada. And he was receiving honorary doctorates from the University of Toronto. He goes on and he lives a very old life, and he actually dies. And there's the government of Canada holds a big reception for him to honor this loyal public servant and to honor him as a Confederate poet. There were awards named after him. His memory was alive in the consciousness of Canada while Bryce was forgotten. You see, Bryce had the moral courage to stand up and say what needed to be said. He understood that being a Canadian is more than painting a maple leaf on your face and showing up on Canada Day. In fact, saying that you believe in anything truly means that you have the courage to lift a country up by its pain and bring it into alignment with the values it says it has. The time clock continues on, and this report is actually in my office. It's written by a guy named James Caldwell, and it's dated 1967. I would have been 3 years old then. And he is looking at the work of children in residential schools. And he finds at that point 80% of the kids in residential schools are placed by that not properly cared for provision. And he also makes a call that what we need are preventative services to keep these families together. This report found its way into the Department of Indian Affairs. This report looks very much like the tribunal's decision. And yet it was repeatedly ignored. It was ignored. It was accepted, it was welcomed, but it was ignored. Then we get up to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996. Aboriginal agencies have inherited many of the problems of agencies they replaced. We took over child welfare, but they gave us a straitjacket of funding and legislative measures. And you know what the truth is? The reason I got my PhD in social work and later my law degree is because I actually wanted to understand what evidence they had that the child welfare system works for non-Aboriginal kids. And when you actually look at it, there's not a lot of evidence that it works at all. So why are people so insistent on imposing it on us, right? You can see here, they struggle with ill-fitting rules made outside of their communities. I remember the day RCAP came out. I was a social worker working at one of those agencies. I thought my problems were over with, that they finally would get the supports to help these families in the way that we wanted to. That was 1996. When Sheila Fraser retires, she does a survey of the Auditor General's reports. She did one on child welfare. She found the First Nations agencies are underfunded. Inequitable funding, she says. She talks about the lack of implementation of Jordan's principle that ensures that children on reserve get equitable access for services. The federal government agrees with all the recommendations, and then they ignore them. They ignore them. That's why I told Dr. Bryce that day before the apology about the case. And I told him I would be back when the kids won the case. I told him I'd be back. I had no idea it would be 8 years later, right? people expect me to be nicer to the government. I sometimes hear that even from the government, you know? And what they don't understand is I'm not against the government. I'm against racial discrimination against children. And they should be against that too. They should be against that too. You know what we have drunk? The toxic potion of incremental equality, where First Nations children get less across every realm of experience. And the government comes out and they will give you a little bit more, but you're still receiving far less than everybody else. And we're supposed to be thankful for being just racially discriminated against. We're supposed to be nice. But it's not about being nice, because the reality for the children hasn't changed. This is one of the documents about the danger of all of us not rising up. It counts the number of nights that First Nations children have spent in foster care between 1989 and 2012 on reserve. Only on reserve. And I can tell you that it's 12 times more likely to be in foster care if you're First Nations. Slightly less than that. The overrepresentation isn't as bad for Métis or Inuit children, but still significant. But that's not the way those little kids think about it. They think about, how many sleeps till I see my mom? It's the same way that the little kids in residential schools thought about it. And when you add up all those nights, it's over 66 million nights, or 187,000 years of childhood. That's the price of us not rising up and demanding better of the government and of ourselves. Every night that number grows by 9,500. Every night. And the federal government knows about these inequalities in child welfare. They know how to fix them, and they haven't done it. I was one of those people like Bryce who believed that if they only knew, they would do better. That's why I am, along with many other people, some of whom are in this room, were part of 2 studies with the federal government documenting the shortfalls in 2000 and 2005 that found that 30% shortfall that Wob talks about. And more importantly, proposed evidence-based solutions. The government liked those solutions, and then they ignored them. And that's what led us to filing that case. I remember the news of the day. The government was saying, well, they shouldn't have just rushed to the courtroom. But I don't know about you, but I think after, I don't feel that 10, 12 years is rushing. I had seen a lot of prime ministers come and go during those 10 years. We had just alleged the Assembly of First Nations National Chief Phil Fontaine. I really want to recognize him because of his political leadership and courage. I'm for filing that case. It was really a due credit to him. We filed that case against the Canadian government. We were alleging on our collective watch that the federal government was racially discriminating against 163,000 children by failing to provide equitable supports to give those kids a fair chance to grow up at home, and by failing to implement Jordan's principle. It was about that bare floor, striving for that bare floor that Wob talks about. And there was nobody there. But I believed, like Bryce, the answer was in screaming out into that silence and hoping someone heard. And so we created the I Am a Witness campaign. Discrimination does not like a witness, especially discrimination against kids. And especially a witness with a microphone, they do not like. So we created the I Am a Witness campaign. It loads all the government's documents, all of ours. I don't ask you to take a side, I simply ask you to watch. As the case made its way through the next 9 years, where Canada would use technical arguments, even though behind the scenes in secret documents, it was costing out the shortfalls to nearly $500 million. They weren't defending the case on the facts. They were defending the case on legal technicalities. The first group to rally around it was not the adults. It was children. I remember walking into the tribunal room and hoping that someone would be there. And often nobody was. But in 2009, that changed. When a group of high school students walked into that room and the young man told me they're from alternative school. And this is around the time of the surveillance that I experienced. And he told me, he said, we're from alternative school, which means we get into trouble a lot. And I said, good, because so do I. And what we need to teach kids to do in reconciliation is to get into trouble for doing the right thing. Just like Bryce did. More of us have to be prepared to get into trouble for doing the right thing, right? And when it comes down to it, children are often much more courageous than the rest of us. They're even more courageous than youth. They step up and they do something. And so by the time we were finishing the case, so many children were coming to the court case, we had to book them in shifts. And they could see all of this mess happening with the government, that the government really knew what it was doing was wrong. This is another slide that's important because it shows that they not only know they're underfunding child welfare, they're underfunding education, social assistance, and other programs too. And in order to make up that shortfall in these programs, because they're so desperately underfunded, are they going to Treasury Board? No. They wanted to report a surplus budget for the Conservative election. So they took the money out of the money for building schools, water, and housing to the tune of $98 million a year, right? So those houses weren't getting built, those schools weren't getting built. Then we're waiting for the decision. Out comes the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. I open up the book and there, number 1 is child welfare. And number 3 is Jordan's Principle. And I was so grateful to those survivors because they knew that the real legacy, the most important legacy that they could leave is kids like Wobbs being able to speak their own language, walking with their head up, and non-Aboriginal children growing up in a society where they didn't have to say they're sorry. But I still wondered what the government would do. Then we had the new government come in. And I remember the sunny days and everything else like that. But this was not my first liberal rodeo. And I wondered about the machinery of government. I'm not saying one party over another, but the machine has been oiled to a specific purpose. The decision comes out in January. I was at a graduation party. I got the embargo copy 2 days before everybody else did. And it's hard to sit on good news, especially when you talk as much as I do. It was surreal because what was ever in that PDF that came on my phone was going to affect 163,000 kids. I remember thinking, did we argue it well enough? Did we pay enough attention to it? Did we do enough of the job? And even though this graduation party was very happy, the whole room went silent. I couldn't hear anything. I couldn't see anything. Time was not going past. And I finally got the courage up to press that button. And the first line of the decision says, this decision is about children, underlined. And I knew it was going to be okay. But almost instinctually, I wanted to leave. I had to leave because I had a promise to keep. You see, back when I saw Bryce the day before the apology, I told him I would be back. So I grabbed my teddy bear, Spirit Bear. I hang out with a lot of teddy bears and glitter, and I tell you, my life is a lot more interesting than those who go into the legislature. And this bear had seen it all. He'd witnessed the entire case. And the children would often come and grab him and tell him stories and then put him back on the judge's desk. And so I grabbed the bear, and he and I went and we bought some brightly colored daisies. And I walked through the snow to see Dr. Bryce. And I put the bear on his headstone, and I read him the decision. And I said, justice, Dr. Bryce, finally justice. And I know that Edward B. was there too that day, in that cemetery, all alone. And you can see what the panel says, that Canada's current treatment is not narrowing. Don't get yourself into a toxic idea that this is over. Canada's current treatment of this generation is widening the disadvantage from residential schools, not narrowing it. And they also found Canada's arguments to be unreasonable, unconvincing, and not supported by the preponderance of evidence. I could have told them that 20 years ago. And the elders could have told them that many decades before that. They've always known better. There's a great group called Project of Heart that's teaching this generation of kids so that they know better. So that when people like Bryce scream into a group like you, you're not able to turn it off. That it will grate against your conscience until you rise up and demand better of your country. You know, that day when I went to see Dr. Bryce, he was no longer forgotten. Beechwood Cemetery, thanks to their work at the TRC and Kairos and Project of Heart, we decided we would put up a plaque for Dr. Bryce to remember this great man, to honor him so that everyone would know the great example of moral courage that he stood for. And so I walked by that plaque and I put the bear there. But then I put the bear, because it was winter, I had a shopping bag. I put him in a shopping bag and I told him, you better stay in the bag for the next visit. Because over the hill is Duncan Campbell Scott. Now, I had been to see Duncan Campbell Scott the day before the TRC release, actually about a week before. I always knew he was there, but I never had the moral courage to go over and see him. And I wanted to make sure I was in a good frame of mind, because his daughter is also buried there. A lot of people, one of the things that I find so interesting about Duncan Campbell Scott's story is that by all accounts, he was a loving father of a single girl who died of scarlet fever in a boarding school in Paris. And he was heartbroken. And yet he wasn't able to connect that with what was happening with Bryce. So I wanted to approach his burial place in honor of her too. So I put some tobacco down and I did my bit. And then I walked by a plaque that had him commemorated as a great Confederate poet, just like I'd learned in high school. And I thought, this thing needs a revision. And so this is us in November. And this is Duncan Campbell Scott's burial place. And if you go there now, it will have the words Confederate poet and cultural genocide in the same plaque. Huh? You are not remembered by what your friends and family will write in your obituary. The elders have always told us that you are remembered in your actions. You're remembered in your actions. This is where Duncan Campbell Scott used to work. The building still stands there on Spark Street. It's called the Booth Building. And I don't know, he was on the 5th floor. And I remember going to the Booth Building when I first moved to Ottawa from BC to take on this case with the federal government. And it has a long, wieldy staircase on the top. But I imagine while Duncan Campbell Scott was toiling away, he had no way of knowing that a number of years later, it would become the headquarters They've moved out of there now. You know, I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, who do you want to be in this challenge we jointly share on reconciliation? Do you want to be Peter Henderson Bryce and Edward B? Or do you want to be Duncan Campbell Scott? Because the truth is, there's lots of rewards for being silent in the short, and a conformist to bad ideas in the short term. But at the end of the day, what really matters is what legacy we're leaving for those children who will never remember us. they'll never know our names. And you better behave well, because there may be a little girl walking by your grave 100 years from now who says, oh, I think that needs a revision. So get out there, press for this case. The federal government isn't implementing it. Those kids still need you. Stand up and don't demand anything else than for them to get a country by the 150th birthday of this nation, where racial discrimination is no longer fiscal policy at the federal government. Thank you.